Well, another pleasant summer's day, evening. Look, I want to talk about James Straiter and James Straiter's day. Now, I'm sure most of you will not be familiar with who James Straiter was. That's not your fault. I wasn't familiar with him till a few months ago. Well, sometime last year. And it's interesting that in a period where the trade union movement has been so weak for a variety of reasons, that we look at the beginning of the trade union movement in this country. Because many, if not most, of the privileges we take for granted, especially in the workplace, are directly related to strikes and occupations, picket lines and trade union activity over generations. And the new legislation which is currently going through Parliament, the new Industrial Relations Law, goes a very small way in rolling back some of the most noxious parts of the conservative legislative agenda in order to criminalise and almost outlaw trade union activity in this country. That's why I think it's important we go back to the very beginning to see how the union and the trade union movement, the trade union and labour councils developed, and the importance of individual action. Because people forget that it's individual action that in the majority of cases helps to mobilise people around particular issues. Now, on the 1st of March 1822, that's 202 years ago, James Straiter, a convict, found himself before the Liverpool Magistrates Court in Botany Bay. And he faced what we would consider to be a relatively minor charge in 2024. But in 1822, it went to the very heart of the type of society that was developing in Australia 34 years after the colonisation process began in 1788. Now, Mr. James Straiter was a convict, possibly a ticket of leave man, and they were assigned to the squatters. Because you've got to understand that Australia was based on three principles. The first principle was genocide, and we saw that unfold over a century and a half. Now, genocide meant that you could actually take over lands that had been inhabited by people for over 60,000 years. And we incorporated this genocide in our Australian political institutions to the extent that it wasn't until 1992 that the High Court of Australia in the Eddie Mabo decision found that Australia was not terra nullius, the land of no one, because the colonisation process had been legalised on the terms that Australia belonged to no one. So after the genocide, there was all this land. Now, a lot of people think of Australia as a colony which was built up by individuals, the flotsam and jetsam of Europe that came to Australia in order to eke out a living. Maybe that's the reality after the 1850s. But during the most of the transportation era, that's 1788 to 1868, when over 162,000 convicts were sent to this country, 1 in 45, 3,500 being political prisoners, you begin to realise the extent that what was happening in Britain was intertwined with what was happening in the colonies. Because although we speak about corporatisation and globalisation, the British Empire, the empire in which the sun never set, was basically an empire which was based on corporatisation, private enterprise and globalisation. So in 1822, gentlemen of name and quality were given free land. The riff-raff, the failures of the British nobility, the fourth sons, found themselves in Australia, cashed up, given free land, which had been created through the genocide of a people that had lived here for over 60,000 years. But they had one problem. They needed labour. Because obviously they're not going to get their hands dirty, because the concept of the gentleman and lady, comes from the idea that you don't actually have to work in order to make a living, to live very well. You rely on rents and other people's labour. So gentlemen of name and quality came to this country and were given thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of acres for nothing. Now, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution had profound consequences, not just in England or Great Britain, but the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. Because when there is a revolution in terms of the way people earn their living, a radical political change is not far away. So here we have three land genocide. There is one element missing: free labour. That's right. Because sheep and wool was the perfect squattocracy's way it developed. Sheep created wool. Wool didn't require to be refrigerated, not that refrigerators existed in 1822. It could be transported quite easily to England, where it fed the satanic mills that had been created as a direct consequence of the closure of the commons and the forceful relocations of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people into the mills who worked a hand-to-mouth existence. But in Australia you had convicts, and these convicts were assigned to the squatters, the gentlemen of name and quality, in order to provide the labour on these vast runs which were needed to create enough wool to be exported across to Great Britain in order to create a fortune for the gentlemen of name and quality. So convict men and women and ticket of leave men and women were assigned to these squattocracies. Some were quite vicious, some were reasonable, but they all paid the ticket of leave men and women and the convicts in terms of board and food. Board and food, although theoretically they should receive a wage, a small wage, maybe £5 a year, that wage went into paying for the board and food. And just as an interesting aside, the children of these ticket of leave men and women refused to work for board and food. They wanted cash. So they were defined, they were known as currency lads and lasses, but that's just a little aside. But going back to 1822, now Mr. Straiter was transferred for one squatter's run to Hannibal MacArthur's run. Yes, the famous MacArthurs, the merino sheep, the people we worship in Australia. He was transferred to their run. to look after sheep, 350. Each convict was responsible for 350 sheep. But what happened in the transfer, his flour ration was reduced from 17 pounds a week to 9 pounds a week. It was nearly halved. The meat ration remained the same, 7 pounds a week. Convicts were paid with flour and meat. That was normally enough to sustain them, prevent starvation. At the same time, they were usually boarded in crude log, wattle huts, which they paid dearly. So James Straiter was really annoyed. He was very annoyed. He was a loud man, I understand, and he couldn't understand why his flour ration had been almost reduced in half. So he started talking and throwing his weight around among the other convicts. His behaviour was seen by the overseer, who quickly had him arrested and transported to Liverpool to face 3 magistrates. And he was charged with exciting, that's right, exciting his master's servants to combine. That's the key word, to combine, in order to oblige him to increase their wages and improve their rations, or otherwise destroy their master's property in sheep entrusted to their care. In other words, James Straiter was saying, if our rations aren't improved, if my rations aren't improved, we should get together during the lambing season and we should refuse to feed the sheep and assist them during the lambing season. He understood that they had real power, because the squatters didn't get their hands dirty, or their overseers. It was the convicts who did the work. So this individual rebellion, that's what it was, this individual rebellion sent shockwaves through the penal colony at Botany Bay. It sent shockwaves because everybody understood his little rebellion struck at the very heart of the system, which enriched a few at the expense of many. The slaughter of this country's First Nations people and the dehumanisation and exploitation of convict labour and the labour of ticket and leave men and women. And ticket and leave men and women were basically people who were on parole. So he faced the magistrates, and obviously, I'll repeat the charge again, and I've actually looked at the court documents which are available if you want to find them on the net through Trove. Excite his master's servants to combine, and that's the key. Unionism is about people combining to improve their situation. To combine in order to oblige him to increase their wages and improve their rations, or otherwise destroy their master's property in sheep entrusted to their care. Now everybody knew that if there was no free labour, profits would dramatically fall, and this man needed to be made an example of. This simple shepherd, this convict who's been written out of this country's historical records, apart from a few people remembering, was found guilty. And for his troubles, remember, he didn't kill any sheep, he didn't steal anything, he didn't actually was able to convince his fellow convicts to go on strike, but for the very fact of raising these ideas, he was sentenced to 500 lashes. That's an extraordinary sentence. Most men didn't survive 100 lashes, were very ill after 100. 500 lashes. And if he survived the 500 lashes, he was then sentenced to 1 month in solitary confinement on bread and water, and if he survived that, he would be sent to Port Macquarie, one of the harshest penal colonies in New South Wales, where rogues from the Norfolk penal settlement were sent. Now, I haven't been able to find out what happened to James Straiter, whether he survived the whipping. But I do know that a number of years later, there was an inquiry into the harshness of the sentences which were being handed out to convicts and ticket of leave men and women, because people were beginning to understand that they had power if they combined. Now today, in 2024, in this country which likes to think of itself as a liberal democracy, as I stated before, striking is illegal except during an enterprise bargaining agreement period when you jump through about 50 hoops. Individual workers can be fined $10,000 a day, and they have been fined $10,000 a day for being involved in a wildcat strike. That's a strike outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period. Unions are fined millions, tens of millions of dollars for trying to look after the health needs of their workers. Union officials are not able to go onto job sites. Unions are seen as criminal organisations. And we've seen government after government remove what little power unions are able to exercise. In 2024, Australia, you can be jailed for up to 25 years for being involved in an occupation. Obviously, in a country where there is no constitutional rights to freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom to withdraw your labour, any law that goes before both houses of parliament and is passed by the parliamentarians has profound impacts on people. So no wonder today, less than 12% of people are in unions, and most of these are in public service unions, and I think the number in the private sector is even much lower. Apart from a few of the more militant unions, most unions basically work towards enterprise bargaining agreement negotiations. Now, almost every single thing that we take for granted today, holiday pay, sickness pay, a basic wage, minimum wage, workplace conditions, and the list goes on and on, are directly related to innumerable struggles by men and women in the colonies before Federation, in Australia after Federations, to improve their situation. And in 2024, every time a conservative reactionary government gets into power, we see more and more union rights being legislated away. I'm sure the North Koreans would be very happy with the type of legislation we have to control trade unions, if not the Chinese and the Russians. I mean, we like to think we're a bit different, but when it comes to workers exercising their rights, we're not. So why James Straiter Day? Well, I believe it's important that we remember the past, because we need to understand the past. We need to remember the past to understand the present and change the future. And unless we combine, whether it's through public interest before corporate interest or a trade union or any other organisation, the ability to fight back is minuscule and insignificant. Individuals can initiate change, but that change only comes about when people combine. And that's why the 1st of March 1822, the day that James Straiter faced the Liverpool Magistrates Court in Botany Bay, Sydney, is so important for us to remember. So this year we are organising a celebration of the beginning of the trade union movement and the labour movement. A celebration in Melbourne which you can replicate anywhere across this country. It doesn't matter how big or small the city or the regional town you live in is. But in Melbourne on the Friday the 1st of March, we'll be meeting at the 8-hour monument across the road from the Melbourne Trades and Labour Council at midday, to remember James Straiter, to remember his sacrifice, and to remember it's only when we combine that change occurs. Interestingly, a few years later, in 1828, the authorities were so concerned about the rumblings which were occurring among the convicts and the ticketed leave men and women, because they were unhappy with the free labour they had to provide in order to survive, passed the Masters and Servants Act. That's right, the Masters and Servants Act, where workers could be jailed for refusing to work. Let's not forget that I think it was in 1969 that Clary O'Shea, the secretary of the Tramways Union, was jailed in Victoria, and that many trade unionists over the years have been jailed for looking after their members' interests. So come and join us midday, Friday the 1st of March, at the 8-hour monument across the road from Melbourne Trades Hall at the corner of Lygon and Victoria Street in Melbourne. Bring food and drinks. Let's make a celebration of it. Open microphone. We'd like as many people as possible to come, and if there are enough, we'll march through the city. So come and join us on that day. Bring flags, bring banners, bring your friends, take a day off work, because it's a day that we need to place in the calendar of events in this country. I'm sick and tired of people celebrating Invasion Day and King Charlie's birthday. It's time we celebrated significant days like Eureka Day, Mabo Day, James Straiter Day, and the National First Nation Freedom Fighters Day, 20th of January, Eureka Day, 3rd of December, Mabo Day, 3rd of June, James Straiter Day, the beginning of the trade union movement, the 1st of March. See you there for this first celebration. 202 years too late, but it's never too late to acknowledge and celebrate the past.